Hi, I'm Travis Childs, Director of Education and your St. Joseph County historian from the History Museum here in South Bend. Welcome to Time Travels with Travis. We are standing in almost the industrial center of what used to be the Industrial Revolution of South Bend. We're standing on what used to be Stevenson Underwear Mills property, but we're more focused in on what's up behind me across the river over by where the Century Center is, and the concrete walkway that you see over my left shoulder. In 1823, James Oliver was born in Scotland, came over to America when he was about 12 or so, and by 1855, he had got a job in a small, already existing steel foundry or iron foundry that was on the West Race, which is over my right shoulder, basically where you see the big windows of the Century Center. He bought into that company, saved his pennies, saved his dimes, and eventually became the head CEO of what he would later call the Oliver Plow Works. For 2 years, between 1855 and 1857, James tried to figure out a way to make a cast iron plow blade that was more durable and less brittle than the current, at his time, old, just single piece cast iron plow blade. They didn't cut the earth clean. They had problems with earth collecting on them, on the faces of the plow. They would ride up out of the ground. You'd have to stop. So James, for 2 years, figured out a way and designed a special type of mold that allowed him to control how fast and how slow he could cool down the molten iron that he could make into a plow blade. He figured it out in those 2 years and then applied for a United States patent. He called that patent the chilling process. And so that's why his plow from then on out was named the Oliver Chilled Plow, because of that one invention. When James died in 1908, he had been granted 49 U.S. patents, mainly on plow design and plow improvements. But it all started on the West Race. In 1857, he applied for his patent in June and received a patent for that. He was making plows, not exclusively making plows, but he was making other iron products that other people would contract with him, like Notre Dame. Notre Dame contracted with him at this time in the late 1850s to make building columns or steel columns for some of their building projects up on campus. And he made all kinds of other things that anybody needed, like window weights, horseshoes, anything. They could make anything, gear wheels. But eventually, by about the 1870s, early 1870s, he couldn't keep up with production with his little factory down here on the West Race. Plus, it was now the time in scientific history that steam engines had come in, and steam power was real big. And steam power is very powerful. And so a lot of the factories that were located down here on the East Race, where we're standing, and the West Race, left because the train had come through. They had finally laid rail lines between the eastern United States and Chicago, and factories wanted to locate themselves along those rail lines as close as they could so they could get raw products in and get finished products out. James was no different. He could not expand any further down here because he was kind of landlocked. So he actually kept a lookout and bought 100 acres of an old farm that was on, at that time it was out in the country, but at the corner of Chapin and Sample Street. And that's where we'll head next, where the story of the Oliver Chilled Plow Works actually really develops and becomes internationally known. And James's son, J.D., takes an important role in the company and allows him to become financially stable, that he was able to build Copcha Home, which he moved into 125 years ago this year. So we've left West Race, and we are now here on the property of the 100 acres that James bought and J.D. purchased in 1875. They bought this on purpose because the rail line from Chicago to the East Coast is right over here. And he had all this land that butted right up to the railroad track and went all the way almost to Sample Street, almost. That was a later expansion. But all of this property that we're standing on right now was where the Oliver Chill Plow Works, eventually the Oliver Farm Equipment Corporation, and eventually White Farm Equipment actually produced tillage equipment right on this spot. Most of the buildings are gone. There's a few buildings over on Arnold Street just to the west, and the only real factory building even left was, luckily, they kept Mr. Oliver's powerhouse, which is to my left here behind me. The powerhouse allowed James to leave the West Race because he was able to purchase a Corliss steam engine, and the steam engine was inside the powerhouse. It ran for the power for the buildings and all of the plants. They had what they call kind of like a split rail pulley system, and you were able to operate all your machinery from belts, and all those belts ran from the steam engine that was here. And of course the steam engine ran on coal eventually in the first part, and it needed a smokestack to exhaust all the coal smoke. Eventually though, the Corliss steam engine went out of style. Electricity came out here. Now when James moved out here in 1875, 1876, this was the rural part of Indiana, rural part of South Bend in the county. So he was actually far away from downtown. Today, nah, not so much. This is still the metropolitan area of South Bend. But back when James and JD built their factory out here, this was the country. So he was able to get rid of this Corliss steam engine when electricity came out because he was able to build his own power plant here. And so the powerhouse became a coal-fired boiler that boiled steam water, boiled water for steam to turn electric turbines that powered the entire plant. Now when we were down in the West Race, electricity and hydroelectricity was not new to James. At the outlet of the West Race, James, one of his last things that he oversaw, one of his last building projects, was to build a hydroelectric plant on the outlet of the West Race, where the West Race water emptied back into the St. Joe River. And he built a hydroelectric plant there that provided, now this is like 1906, 1907, and that provided power, hydroelectric power, for the Oliver Opera House, which was downtown, the Oliver Opera House, the Oliver Hotel. It powered James's house, which was in the 600 block, 500 block of West Washington Street, and eventually Cobb's home, J.D. Oliver's home. So this is where the Oliver Company grew up. James would, as time and money allowed, would build onto other part buildings that were already here. They had foundries, they had warehouses, they even had their own rail system inside the plant's property proper, in the fact that he was able to build and take a switch or a line off of the main rail line over here into his factory so that they could get all their finished plows out and get raw products in, like iron, scrap iron, iron ore, pig iron, all of that in here into the plant area. So this is where the Oliver plant actually grew up and was actually matured and actually became an international business. When James died in 1908, of course, JD, his only son, took over control of the company. He became the CEO. When James and JD were together, they made a perfect business pair. James didn't know how to really even balance his own checkbook. JD loved to be a bookkeeper, loved to be a marketer. James wanted to be out in the factory every day, and he was. So they made a perfect business partnership together. What one weakness one had, the other had the strength. And so it was a great pairing. When one of that pair was gone, when James died, JD did the best he could, and with the help of the office staff that he had and the board of trustees that he had, he was able to grow the company leaps and bounds. They were selling plows to South America, to Russia, to Scotland, to England, Egypt, Africa, everywhere. And so everybody knew the Oliver name because of that, mainly because of JD's foresight. By 1929, of course, JD is having some health issues that's related to business. It's tough to be a single business owner. especially a worldwide international concern that the Oliver Company was. And so when JD decided to retire in 1929, he foresaw that the company would not survive by just making plows anymore, just plows. Farming was getting more scientific. It was also changing with scientific discoveries all the time. And JD saw that and said, before I retire, we are going to buy out other farm equipment manufacturers who make other things beyond plows. Tillage equipment, tractors, the Hart Power Tractor Company of Charles City, Iowa, threshing machines, hay baling equipment, all kinds of things. And so he bought those companies out and then brought them under the umbrella of the Oliver Company. And all of those products ceased to have their original names and became known as Oliver equipment. So that's why you have Oliver tractors, Oliver hay baling equipment, Oliver threshing machines, that sort of thing. So that was JD's doing. When JD and James were at the height of their production level here, they were one of the top 5 wealthiest men in Indiana. This allowed James a stage of comfort as well as JD. It allowed JD to build his own house that he called Cobsholm after James's birthplace in Scotland. That's why he was able to build that house, because of his wealth. He was able to build that and move in 1897, which is 125 years ago this year. James and JD, like I said, perfect business pairs, business partnership, fantastic. When JD retired, basically the oversight of the company was controlled by a group of men, and that was moved. The headquarters was actually moved to Chicago. And they oversaw the day-to-day operations. It expanded. Eventually, by the 1950s and 60s, farming is taking a different turn. It doesn't take 5 families of farmers to plow the same acre of land. You only have to have one, because the equipment is getting better and the science is getting better and planting and agricultural genetics is getting better and fertilizing is getting better. So you didn't need hundreds and hundreds of farm equipment manufacturers. And so the Oliver Company became kind of a victim of that. And eventually White Farm Equipment came in and bought them out. White Farm Equipment struggled along. They didn't keep up with rising technology. And eventually by the 1970s, they were in serious financial trouble and started to sell off a lot of the equipment manufacturing that the Oliver plant was doing all across the United States and all across the world. And so by the 1980s, plant number 1, which is the plant area that we're standing on now, the Oliver Company, was also in financial trouble, and White Farm Equipment closed it in 1985. All of the buildings in the plant were basically vacant for years. There were some companies that would come in, they would leave. I believe the Women, Infant, and Children's Center was in their old main office for a while. But by the late 1990s, the buildings had fallen down. A lot of them had fallen down. A lot of them were in bad shape. The city eventually purchased the lot of the entire factory plan out here and started tearing the buildings down to make a warehousing and industrial space, and that's what they've done. And so luckily, of all the buildings that they had to tear down, they kept one, and that was Mr. Oliver's powerhouse. The powerhouse was kept, and the family that founded Rose Brick and Building Supplies bought the building, and they restored it, used it as their main office and their showroom, and we're really happy that they did. They did a great job. People do stop by here. I'm standing in the memorial that was set up for James and his invention, and has the history of the company here. If you get a chance, when the weather gets a little bit better, come down, take a look. I'm glad that you came along with us for this Time Travel with Travis. I'm Travis Childs, Director of Education at the History Museum and your St. Joseph County historian. We'll see you on the next Time Travel.